My name is Erica Bond. I serve as the Vice President of Justice Initiatives at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I am honored to be moderating this very important conversation about how New York City is working to build a safer and more equitable future for all. This event is co hosted by the John Jay College Future of Public Safety Initiative, as well as the National Network for Safe Communities, which is a center here at John Jay, as well as our Office of External Affairs. We are grateful for the generous support from Councilmember Gail Brewer and the New York City Council. So thank you to the council member and the council for making this program possible. And before we start the conversation, I'd like to give just a few housekeeping items. One is the webinar is being recorded. Second, the views expressed here are those of the presenters individually, not John Jay College or our partner organizations. And last, the Q&A feature is enabled, and we invite you to enter any questions that you may have throughout the webinar into that box. We're going to reserve a bit of time at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. So with that, let us get into the program. So when we talk about public safety, intimate partner violence and community violence are often treated as separate challenges. But we know from the research and from lived experience that these two forms of violence are actually quite deeply interconnected. And both forms of violence are shaped by similar root causes, including structural inequities, exposure to trauma, social isolation, and harmful norms around power and control, among others. And both forms of violence are entirely too prevalent in our communities. According to a report from the National Network on Safe Communities, which we will drop into the chat for those that want to read it, each year, community violence and intimate partner violence together take thousands of lives while injuring and traumatizing many more. They overwhelm healthcare, criminal legal, and social service systems. They cost over $100 billion per year in system responses and lost productivity. And perhaps worst of all, they tear apart affected families and communities. So here, closer to home in New York City, the mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence reports there are more than 230,000 annual reports of domestic incidents, and that's quite likely an undercount of the actual number of domestic incidents. And intimate partner homicide remains a leading cause of death for women citywide. And at the same time, the NYPD has recorded over 1,000 shooting incidents last year. And so these are not parallel problems, they are part of the same ecosystem of harm. A common misconception is that intimate partner violence is purely a private issue that takes place in the home and out of sight of the community, while community violence is a public one. However, NNSC has done an analysis of 43 communities across the country, and they found that 5% of community violence incidents are related in some way to domestic violence, and 25% of domestic violence incidents involve someone who's also engaged in violence in the community. So the data also proves out that these are interrelated issues. And the failure to recognize these intersecting patterns of violence has often led to fragmented policies, siloed funding, and incomplete responses and solutions. And by addressing these issues together through a coordinated public health, safety, and social service strategy, we believe we can better support survivors, hold people who cause harm accountable, and build stronger and safer communities. And we're going to get into what some of that coordinated response might look like as we talk with our really fabulous panelists today. So I'd like to introduce each of them. I'm joined today by an incredible panel of experts and advocates who are leading this work both in New York City and across the country. And as I introduce them, we will drop their full bios into the chat because they are too long and impressive to go over here. But first, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Saloni Sethi. She leads the New York City Mayor's Office to end domestic and gender-based violence. Commissioner Sethi leads a critical office within city government that supports survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. The office works to enhance prevention efforts and develop innovative and responsive programming to assist survivors on their journey. So welcome, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us today. We also have with us Sasha Cotton. Sasha is the executive director of the National Network for Safe Communities. NNSC, as it's sometimes called, is an internationally recognized action research center at John Jay that provides proven, evidence based, and life saving violence reduction strategies to dozens of communities across the United States and beyond. Before joining NNSC, Sasha was the first director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention that sits in the Minneapolis Health Department. And of particular relevance to today's conversation, Sasha previously served as the National Resource Center coordinator at the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American community. And she also served as the prevention program manager for Violence Free Minnesota, which was is the state's domestic violence coalition. We are also joined by Carolyn Betances. She is the RISE project director at the Center for Justice Innovation. She guides the development of community based programs and initiatives that address the intersection of intimate partner violence, gun violence, and community accountability. She's also the co founder of Healing Roots, a collective dedicated to cultivating spaces of healing, accountability, and cultural affirmation for communities that are impacted by violence. And then finally, we have with us Donna Hilton. Welcome, Donna. She is the founder and CEO of A Little Piece of Light. She's an activist and an author. She advocates for the rights and well being of women and girls who've been impacted by intersectional trauma, such as violent and sexual abuse and assault, domestic violence, police brutality, and incarceration. She is an outspoken proponent of the need to incorporate harm reduction into our policies for addressing societal and justice issues within a humane framework. Thank you for joining us today, Donna. And so let's begin by hearing from each of our panelists, just generally about their organization's work and the relationship that they see between intimate partner violence and community violence. So I'm going to kick us off with Sasha. Sasha, if you can jump in, please just tell us a little bit about yourself and NNSC. And I would just note NNSC really started out as a group, as an organization that's focused on group violence intervention, but has really, in recent years and under your leadership, been focused on addressing intimate partner violence. And so help us understand what you see as the connection between these two forms of violence and why it's so crucial that NNSC be helping communities with these issues.
Thanks, Erica. Yes, over the last several years, NNSC has been taking a really targeted look at these intersections. And that's really born out of both the group violence intervention work that you mentioned, but also a separate focus deterrent strategy called intimate partner violence intervention that our director, Fatima Zara, manages at NNSC. And what we've seen over the last many years is that violence doesn't happen in isolation, and that when we're working with people through the group violence intervention, they are often experiencing intimate partner violence in their relationships and vice versa. And so managing and handling those situations as separate and isolated just doesn't serve our communities well. It doesn't serve the practitioners who are delivering services well. And so we've really taken a targeted approach to blend and look at ways that we can train and support the sites that we work with to think about violence as a holistic problem that lots of people face in different ways. And while the solutions may need to be tailor fit, the problem as a whole is that violence is a learned experience, and that we can help people to unlearn it both in the community and in the home.
Thank you, Sasha. And we'll get into a little bit more kind of like what it looks like for you to be supporting communities and addressing this challenge. But before we do that, I'd like to turn to Commissioner Sethi. Your office has been central in shaping New York City's strategy to address gender-based and intimate partner violence. I think it would be helpful for our audience if you could share a little bit about what your office does generally, but also what you're observing in New York City about this intersection between intimate partner violence and community violence.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erica. Happy to be here with all of you. So our office, our one-liner is we coordinate the city's response to gender-based violence, right? Which is, and so when we think about what gender-based violence is, I think that's an important place to start, because the way we define it, internally is we think of it as any form of interpersonal violence that disproportionately impacts women, girls, transgender, and gender expansive folks. So when you think about something like intimate partner violence or even childhood abuse, it doesn't mean that men and boys aren't impacted, but it falls falls under the umbrella of gender-based violence because those who are victimized, it's often overrepresented by women, girls, and trans folks, right? And so we try to look at, kind of as Sasha's saying, we look at all these forms of violence holistically as kind of having similar roots, and while people have different needs, we're really trying to address it as a whole. A lot of what we do, is focused on program development and direct services, right? So we have free accessible services at our 5 family justice centers. We oversee large scale citywide programs like the city's 24-hour hotline, crime victims assistance programs. We do a ton of training, outreach, awareness raising, and prevention education. We have a relationship abuse prevention program that works in middle schools and high schools. We partner a lot with our community-based organizations and city agencies. We want, try and make sure systems are responsive to survivor needs. And we do policy and research development. So a little bit of everything, right? Everything everywhere all at once. And I think one of the things that I really like about this office, and I've been here for about 8 years now with the city for 8 years, is that as our work has evolved, we always keep survivor experiences at the center, right? So I think it's similar to like what Sasha was saying is our office actually started out in 2001 as the Office to Combat Domestic Violence, and then expanded to become the Office to End Gender-Based Violence in recognition that our survivors were often not just experiencing one form of violence, especially throughout the course of their lives, right? And so how do we say we're only going to deal with your intimate partner issue without also dealing with your sexual violence history, right? How do we not address the intersection of these two traumas? And I think similarly when it comes to thinking about community violence and neighborhood violence, it really is that understanding of for the survivors we serve, these experiences aren't discrete, right? They're often living in relationships that are unhealthy and violent while also being in communities that are experiencing violence and how do you tease apart the two or kind of undo that, and I think really that's sort of what sort of informed our work, our move in that direction. And I think the other thing is when it comes to thinking about what does it mean to end gender-based violence? How do we end gender-based violence? Right? We're not going to do it without addressing some of the intergenerational patterns around it. And so I think as Sasha was saying, it's like, we feel very similarly, like something I always say, I'm like, violence is a learned behavior and it's often learned at home, right? That's really where it's learned. Like, where do we first develop these patterns of sort of unhealthy ways of engaging with each other or addressing conflict or addressing um, our sort of our feelings and emotions? It's often at home. And so if we can really kind of hone in on that connection and focus on prevention and changing that behavior and looking at both, I think we can really, make an impact.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner.
Mhm.
Um, Dr. Hilton, I'd love to bring you into this conversation to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you come to this work. I know many of the comments that the commissioner made and Sasha made about sort of thinking holistically about harm and trauma, both intergenerationally and the different forms of violence and trauma that individuals experience is at the center of your work. So please share a little bit about how you think about these issues.
Thank you for that, Erica. And thank you everyone for joining us on this little webinar. So I come to this work. Let me start there, be clear. Uh, I served 27 years in New York State's maximum security prison for women. My journey there was riddled with abuse. To the commissioner's point, it was layered. It wasn't just like one form of abuse. It started sexual abuse, went to, physical and in all other ways. And sadly, as a child, because I was a child when I went into the system, those abuses were perpetuated by people that represented institutions, facilities, places that were supposed to be healing or helpful, assisting, especially for children, meaning school, police officer, you name it, and every person basically um, abused me, did not help me, and so when I got caught into a crime based on the abuse, right? And I don't talk about this much, but I was also a victim within the crime that I was accused of. But that never came out, and that would never come out unless I speak I tell the truth of it, right? So I went into the system. I was sentenced to time, and when I went into Bedford Hills, I was still young, but I started recognizing something quickly. The vast majority of women that I met and became friends and family with, right? When we talk about community, had very similar stories or journeys as mine. All of it abuse in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And so at early on, I started saying something's wrong here. And so it became very apparent that incarceration became and continues to be a response to abuse, those that perpetrate it and those that actually are victims of it, right? Because the vast majority of women inside are victims of some form of abuse. And that didn't seem right. And it still isn't right. And so I got into this world really honestly and authentically inside. Back in the mid 80s, we created a program called the Family Violence Program that sought to address each and every area of the traumas of abuse that impacted our lives. And I don't even hear that conversation now. We have women inside who committed or allegedly committed child, right? Like they murdered their child or whatever. But it was centered around the abuse or been, allegedly, guilty of it. But we're not really talking about how they were victimized themselves in a situation. And because the boyfriend, the husband, whoever the partner may be or may have been, was very instrumental in that, and that person was getting abused. We don't hear about head and nussbaum as much anymore, but that's real, and that it has not stopped. And so, a little piece of light, what we do in this work is try to really shed light on this and saying, hey, incarceration cannot continue to be the response to those that even cause the harm as well as those who are victims of it. Because at some point we have to address and be real about why people do cause harm. These are unhealed people. This goes unchecked. Incarceration does not heal it. We created a program inside again called Family Violence, which during the pandemic was dismantled. It no longer exists. It was the only one of its kind. That should be modeled within these institutions because people still do need to heal and to address and to recognize the harms that they cause, right? And the way in which we do that, we try to help people tap into their humanity. If I can recognize and understand that I'm a human being and I have needs and wants and I hurt and whatever, I that allows me the opportunity to recognize it in another person. And so that's how we started. And that's why we exist today to try to shed light on that, but to create safe spaces for that to happen. But we can't do it if and again, to the commissioner's point, if we don't recognize within communities that there's so many different forms of violence. So many different forms. And we put it under the umbrella of family violence because let's be clear, community is family. There are people in communities right now who call each other cousins, have no blood relation, but that's how when you grow up together and stuff like you share so many things and it's a community. So thus it's a family and we have to heal whole communities. We have to do it on a broader scale than we've been doing it because we are just at the tip of the iceberg. And that's why since the I've been doing this work now, how many years? That 40 years or so? Has not really we've made some strides, but we really have not gotten to the roots of things because we're not addressing the root causes of what causes abuse, why it happens, because we have given it we medicate it with incarceration or whatever, and that's not going to work. It won't continue to work.
Thank you, Dr. Hilton, for sharing and being willing to share about your own history of trauma in service of actually creating more safety and healing for all of us and for all of our communities. And I really do want to get into this conversation about what are the responses that we can bring to communities that aren't necessarily the traditional approach, seeing that incarceration has not been able to achieve the kind of healing that we know we need for all forms of violence. So I'm going to actually turn it over then to Carolyn to talk a little bit about the work that you do with RISE in the community as part of the Center for Justice Innovation. I know that you're really working to kind of leverage the existing investments the city has made in the crisis management system and really be intentional about thinking about what are the resources we have in the community that maybe aren't focused on intimate partner violence or family violence, if we want to sort of broaden the lens a bit. So please tell us a little bit about how you come to this work and why CJI decided to focus on this intersection of these two forms of violence.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So RISE is a citywide initiative that is working at the intersection of gun violence and gender-based violence. And we're doing that to create safety, to build safety, healing, and accountability outside of carceral systems. And how Rise came about is that we were born out of two reports that happened earlier with CJI and other individuals. But the reports basically noted that community members understood that gun violence and intimate partner violence was a problem that often intersected, but they didn't know who to reach out to. Some said that they'll reach out to the police, but some said that they didn't feel safe reaching out to the police. And some noted that they once identified as a person who was experiencing harm, but also as a person who was causing harm. So there's that victim and person causing harm overlap that we typically don't talk about in traditional DV responses. And the other report talked about survivors, specifically survivors naming that they wanted solutions that didn't criminalize them, that didn't cause further harm, that didn't break up their families. Many of them talked about how they just wanted the abuse to stop. They didn't want to leave their relationship. They couldn't leave their relationship. We know that survivors have many barriers. And they wanted solutions that really actually worked with the individuals causing harm, not just like locked them away or, threw them out the community temporarily. So out of these two reports, Rise was born. And Rise, I mean, you said it earlier, the work that we do is really leveraging trusted community networks, that gun violence prevention network that does the work across the city, that have credible messengers, people who are trusted and people who are change makers in the community. And we work with these credible messengers to be able to identify people who may be causing harm in their relationships. We work with them, we provide technical assistance to them so they understand what it looks like to cause harm, what it looks like to experience harm, and what it looks like to make your work survivor center. But also they're referring individuals who they know, who they work with, who may experience gun violence, who have been a gun carrier, who may be street network affiliated. They're referring those individuals to us so that way we could work with them and help them start practicing accountability, start changing their behavior, understanding and changing their norms. A lot of the work that we do at Rise is norm change work. We're working with our communities who honestly have experienced over policing, they've experienced racist policies, a bunch of trauma, and have a really hard time responding to harm, but also like practicing. Sometimes the norms that they practice are not the healthiest. And again, it's a norm, it's normalized for them. So we're working with them to be able to create healthier norms. And we try to do this in a way where we're bridging gaps between different systems. We're working with the Gun Violence Prevention Network, but we're also working with NGBV. We're also working with DYCD. We're working with housing systems. We're working with community-based programs. And, you know, I think this whole conversation is about how historically IPV gets siloed from gun violence and community violence, which increases the risk and the gaps in care. So we try to facilitate this cross collaboration and create warm referrals and support coordinated safety planning for the people who are experiencing harm and causing harm. That's something that we do at Rise too. We provide safety planning for people who are causing harm. But we do this and we do a bunch of different, we try to get the community members engaged. And the really big part of our work is that it's non-mandated. We're working with communities, skilling them up so they can hold the responses themselves because we understand that community members have the wisdom and solutions, and we have the power and the strength there. So it really is about skilling them up so they can respond, and we can work outside of carceral systems. And again, we do this in so many different ways, which I'm sure we're gonna dive into later on. But I really just want to hone in that we believe that there can be solutions that are community based, that we don't have to rely on carceral systems. And not only don't we have to rely on carceral systems, survivors are asking for it. For people who are like, why would we even do this? Survivors are naming that they want this. They're naming that they're tired of the systems, of being let down by the systems, being harmed by the systems, being criminalized by the systems. These are our brothers, our sisters, our family, our friends, our neighbors, right? And we can't kick them out. We have to work with them if we really want to truly end domestic violence. And they're naming that, they're understanding that, and they're wanting that.
Thank you, Carolyn. And yes, we will get into some of the kind of the details around how you're doing this work. But I did want to kind of step back to the commissioner a little bit and ask her to give us kind of like an overview of the kinds of either citywide initiatives or pilot programs. I think RISE is one of them that your office is supporting, but where you are really trying to invest resources because you feel like they're the kinds of programs and partnerships that are helping to break the cycles of trauma that Carolyn was just talking about, where, there are victims and survivors who want a response. They don't necessarily want a traditional kind of criminal justice system response. And I know your office has really been leading. So just help us understand kind of what kinds of programs you're really sort of excited about, or where you think there's a lot of potential to really help intervene in ways that are responsive to community needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I'll talk a little about that and some of the challenges in that too. I think, so Rise was born out of an initiative called Interrupting Violence at Home that the city undertook, now 7 years ago to really start investing in this work to be like, what would it mean to start addressing violence where it starts, right, at home? And so, in addition to the work that they do with CMS and the gun violence providers, they're also one of our providers for our abusive partner intervention programs, which is something that our office has invested in. Again, as Carolyn said, at the request of survivors, for survivors saying, I don't want my partner to go to jail. I don't want my kid to go to jail. I just want the abuse to stop, right? And so in listening to that, we develop these programs which are non-mandated programs. We've got two in the city, one for adults called Respect and Responsibility, and one for young people called Respect First, that really focus on changing abusive behavior. And I think two things, right? I think because they're non-mandated, they really become more about focusing on healthy relationships and healthy relationship development, and they really de-silo that like victim abuser kind of dichotomy, right? Because a lot of the work that you're doing when you're kind of addressing why you cause harm is looking at where it comes from, which might be your own past, your own trauma, your own hurt, and then the question of accountability becomes, so now you've been traumatized, so now what do you do with it, right? Like, how do you handle it and show up? And so I think that's work I'm really excited about. Then I think the city will continue to invest in, especially on the non-mandated side, so it's not tied to a criminal justice mandate, right? So it becomes more community based. And then, and we also, another thing I'm sort of excited about that we're developing soon is we're also going to develop programming, as Donna was saying, for family violence, that we should be launching next year, which is going to focus on things like, again, conflict mediation, right? And building those basic skills that people need to like address conflict, which we know will arise. It will in any relationship and in any family situation. So I'm, looking forward to that too.
Thank you, Commissioner. I do want to actually go back to Carolyn because you started to kind
Yeah.
of talk a little bit about how Project Rise is working in communities and how you are engaging survivors. You again, you started to get into this a little bit, but you work with people who actually cause harm, and it sounds like the rationale for that is that's what survivors are um, telling you that they want. They want support for their family members. They want some acknowledgement of the harms that the abusers themselves may have experienced. But tell us, how is it that you're going about that work? How are you really engaging both survivors, but also folks who are causing harm?
Yeah, people always ask, how is our work survivor center if it's working with people who cause harm? And we tell them in many different ways. Like survivor are asking for the solution. They're asking for us to not continuously throw the people who are causing harm into systems that are going to continue that cycle of punishment, a cycle of trauma. We're working closely with survivors to think about responses. We're actually in the process of relaunching our survivors board, which is going to be a board made up of 46 survivors of gender-based violence, who's going to help us inform our work. They're going to help us with our programming, our vet, our public education materials, and we're also going to try to support them with their own professional development. And we're not looking for advocates. We're looking for survivors who are ready to be in a network, a supported network, and who are ready to engage around community-based solutions. But we are also doing this work. When we do this work with the people who are causing harm, we're always talking about how this work is survivor centered. We're not dismissing the harm that's happening to survivors. A lot of this work is about owning and taking responsibility of your actions, understanding what are your actions were, how were they harmful, and understanding and making repairs, right? Making repairs to the people you may have harmed, to your community who you are harmed, and understanding the accountability process and starting that. And we do this. Commissioner Saloni mentioned how we have some accountability groups, Respect First and Respect and Responsibility, but we also have one-on-one sessions where we're working with people through emotional regulation. We're working with them to do some, look at the risks that they may have we're working with them to understand the harm that they've caused. And we're also looking at it a holistic way where we're seeing what other stressors in their life can we support them so that way they may not cause harm in the future. And, I think it's really important that in this process, we're equipping community members as well with the tools and language to be able to safety plan themselves, to be able to, respond to harm and to be able to talk to your friends and family. We talk to people a lot about this, but those jokes, those comments, the dismissing, your friend who's saying this joke about this, like those are the little things that we can all do and we all, can have the tools to respond to. Those little things is like how we start making change. So we really, really work closely with survivors to help us like inform us how we have those conversations with those individuals and how we, navigate those conversations with people who cause harm. And with the people who cause harm, it's really about practicing accountability and helping them change their behaviors.
And I think just one thing to sort of add to that, that I think that makes it so challenging, right? Like now we always talk about like domestic violence, intimate partner violence is hard to talk about because of stigma. And I think now when I start thinking about stigma, the way I sort of started thinking about it, it's because of how pervasive it is, right? It's because like so
Mhm.
many people were either directly impacted by it themselves or know somebody who was impacted, that it's hard to talk about because we haven't processed our own stuff, right? And I think especially if you're not like a direct victim, that can be harder to kind of even open up that conversation with folks. And so when we think about community healing, as Dr. Hilton was saying, like how do we create those spaces where people can kind of identify their own experiences with how this touched them and how it informed, who they are now.
And if I may, I
Yeah,
wanted
just
to add to that. I'm sorry. So, Commissioner and to Carolyn, what you're saying. So, in my experience, what I've recognized is that the, our community people who are saying we don't want the person that's causing harm, our child, our friend, whatever, to for incarceration or punishment to be the response. Why? Because it's happening at home. Right? It's happened to them or it's still happening. And so they don't want that response to themselves. And so people are looking for, other ways to have this addressed or to be called out because it's a cultural sensitivity kind of thing, right? And to what I was trying to say earlier, we don't even talk about the abuse that comes in the form of ritualistic abuse. We created in our family violence program, it was an umbrella for all forms of abuse. We knew that there were some cultures that practice rituals that are different than others. And there's abuse that comes under that lens. And there's abuse that comes in this way and that way. And so there's so many different forms. And we have to be well, empathetic to it, but understand that it exists. Some things we don't even want to talk about. We don't ever want to talk about the woman that or the person that has allegedly killed their child, but that comes out of abuse. Right? Some do it because they want to save the child from the abuse. They don't want them to go through what they went through, or it's just, um, uh, a lash out moment where it's not a continuous thing, but it's a moment of rage, of so much passion, of not being understood, of hurt that happens. And then we want to throw them away. It just can't continue to be the response. So I just wanted to add that.
Erica, if I can just layer on before the next question. Dr. Donna, what you raise is so important because I think one of the things that we're not saying out loud, but I think is inherent here, is that the way that marginalized communities experience violence and systems looks and feels so different. The battered women's movement, the domestic violence movement has often really centered a particular kind of woman, and it doesn't look like most of us on this panel. And so our experiences with systems in general, and that system in particular, has been punitive. It has often been rooted in taking things away, whether that's taking away family, taking away rights, taking away children. It comes at a loss to us as the person who's often calling for help, which only makes us not want to call and receive those services. And so I think so much of what we're trying to do, all of us collectively, is create systems that actually get to the heart of the problem and aren't just focused on punitive measures and punishment, particularly for those who are living in marginalized communities and in marginalized bodies. Someone mentioned, and I'm sorry, I can't remember. Oh, it was you, Commissioner, this issue around conflict resolution. And I think that's so important when we think about intimate partner violence and community violence, because so much of what we're talking about is how do we teach people new skills? How do we help them develop new tools in their toolbox? Because conflict is inherent, right? We all are going to have things we don't agree with. We've grown up differently. We see the world differently. but conflict does not always mean violence. And for some people, that is their lived experience, right? That if I have conflict with you, then that is going to aggress to some form of violence. That's the only way I know how to solve it. And if we can give people new tools, that is ultimately what they need to make better and different decisions. And we know that the carceral system doesn't do that, right? It really reinforces the likelihood that people will use violence to solve problems. So I just felt like it was important to hash that out.
Thank you, Sasha. And actually, this is a good time, I think, to segue a little bit to some of the work that NNSC is doing to really help communities develop those tools, sort of both individually and at the community level, to try to address conflict that, as you noted, it's a part of life. And the question is, how do we respond to it, and what capacity do we have as individuals and as communities? So tell us a little bit about how NNSC is kind of working to support communities in developing kind of nonviolent capacity and approaches to conflict.
Yeah, so two things that we're working on that I think we're really excited about right now is, first I'll talk about borrowing practices. So for a long time, the intimate partner violence movement has focused on safety planning to keep victims of violence safe, to figure out strategies that they can use and document, to have a plan when violence feels imminent, to move away from that violence and to try to plan for how they can seek out safety. And I think good community violence interventionists have also been doing that, but they haven't been writing it down. They haven't had these systems. And so we've really been working with CVI agencies and others doing violence prevention to think about how they can borrow the practice of safety planning explicitly to work with community-based violence, people who are experiencing community-based violence. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a new tool and a new opportunity to use that tool, but also because that documentation, even though it's, the information will be private, the practice of doing it legitimizes the kind of spending that we see in community violence intervention. When we think about the safe housing, the relocation that we do in intimate partner violence, it illustrates why it costs money. But in CVI, it can be very difficult to explain why the amount of resources that are needed are required in order to do this work. And for a variety of other reasons. And obviously, the most important of them is keeping people safe and giving them the tools that they need to feel empowered to manage their own safety and not always have to seek outside resources and systems. So that's one thing we're really excited about. And we've just developed a white paper and released it specifically on that work. The other piece that we're really excited about is a project that we've been working on specifically with Allegheny County. The county seat there is Pittsburgh, is this idea of cross-training. And I know, Caroline, some of what you all do in New York City is really focused on that. But because people are experiencing violence in collective ways, we also need the people who provide services around that violence to be more interconnected and to have the ability to work together. And while the violence is something that pulls us all together, the way that it shows up, the service delivery, and who's delivering it can feel very siloed and separate. People who do intimate partner violence are often women, they're often white women, they're often women who have had lived experiences with domestic violence or as child victim witnesses. People who are on the CVI side of the spectrum usually come to the work with lived experience that they talk about as people who have caused harm. I think it's important to always name that that harm is usually circular, that they have been a victim as well. And that's not something that we talk about enough, that victimization and perpetration are deeply linked in all of this, right? But certainly on the community violence side of it. But how do we get folks to talk about that, talk about their shared experiences instead of focusing on what keeps them separate? There's, often a fight for resources and feeling like, well, this form of violence is more important or this form of violence is more important. But really, keeping people safe is at the center of all of what we do. And we know that ultimately our communities are better served when we work together. And so in the national network, we've really been focused on this idea of the power of partnership. And we are excited that we're in a partnership with Cure Violence Global, and recently received some funding from the Ford Foundation to do just this kind of work. So we've been piloting it in Allegheny County in partnership with the county. They've been an amazing pilot group to work with, and we'll be able to expand to at least one more site with this funding in a strategic partnership with Cure Violence. And so There's a white paper that will be released about some of that work. We've already got a white paper that you mentioned, Erica, about this intersectional work because it is so important. The power partnership is the only way that I see through to keeping our communities safer.
Thank you, Sasha. And we'll make sure that I know we've been putting things up in the chat during the course of the webinar, but afterwards we'll send out an email with a lot of the resources that you and others have mentioned so that folks can take a look at those because it does this is really an emerging field, and so there is not necessarily a lot of documentation around how this work is happening and where there's sort of innovative practices and partnerships happening. So we want to be able to share, what does exist. I do want to keep an eye on the time because I know we've got some questions that folks will want to ask. So I think we've got about 5 more minutes for discussion, and then we'll open it up to some questions. We've really focused primarily, and I think rightfully, on kind of how do we develop more community capacity to look at the intersection and respond to the intersection and overlapping forms of violence. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of ask the commissioner to tell us a little bit about a recent announcement from NYPD about some reorganization that they're doing, because we know that while these community responses are developing, that the formal kind of criminal system is still responding in many ways. To both community and domestic violence, and so it's nice to see that there's some effort from NYPD to sort of change up their response. And so it would be great, Commissioner, if you could just share a little bit about what
Sure.
that announcement was about.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think it's mutually exclusive, right? It's never either or. You got to do all of it because we got to make sure the systems are responsive while we're also know that like the real culture change is going to happen in community, I think, as Carolyn was saying, right? Um, but yeah, but recently the NYPD restructured to have kind of elevate the domestic violence work within the department overall. And so they now are going to have a team of specialized investigators that address domestic violence cases. I think from our perspective, it's great for survivors because it actually reduces the number of people they have to work with when there's an investigation. And as we all know, that is more survivor centered. It means they're not telling their story over and over again to a bunch of different folks, and they have some consistency and can maybe actually build trust with the people that they're working with. And then the other thing I think that, they're also sort of reaffirmed their commitment to is their ongoing collaboration with advocates. And I think we can't really say enough. I think Sasha's talking about partnership and collaboration. We can't say enough how important that is in this work, especially when it comes to working with systems. It's a lot of what our office does is to make sure that they're collaborating across various systems and also make sure that advocates are available to ensure that when survivors reach out, they're getting the kinds of responses that they deserve, right? And the advocates play a dual role of not just supporting survivors, but also making sure that officers continue to be trained and kind of upskill when it comes to domestic and gender-based violence. And so I think that's another really big piece of the change.
Great. Thank you for sharing about that. And I actually did want to ask Dr. Hilton kind of a related question about you talked a lot about the sort of problems with some of the institutional and government responses to violence. And the commissioner here is acknowledging that there are some changes that are happening to city government to try to be more responsive to survivors. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts and your experiences of how survivors' voices can be more meaningfully kind of integrated into program design and into the kinds of citywide strategies for violence prevention that we've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the things that Commissioner, I think I'm saying that we Lupus Light would love to be a part of this as well. And the reason why I'm saying that is because what I continue to see is that those of us who have the cloud, right, of incarceration, that thing, are not, we are considered credible messengers, but we can be very useful in this process as well. And Carol and I, we've spoken about that as well. That's why we help create a collaborative now that exists that partners. We have like 10 organizations across the board that created this collaborative to address these, based on our work, to come together and figure out how do we do this. So it would be wonderful to do this. And I say that because oftentimes, if not the vast majority of times, people want the first person they see to be somebody they can relate to. not a person in a uniform, not a person that represents a uniform or institution or something like that, because the first thing to focus on and that we try to do is how to build trust. Trust is so key in the very in like the first minute of an interaction. You know what I mean? And there's a way to do that. It comes with messaging and things like that, and incorporating those, utilizing the tools that we already have. It's no reason to reinvent wheels, right? We just have to do it a little differently, right? Commissioner, to your point. And so we'd love to be able to do that, because continue to hear that, it's like trust. And so they really need to identify with a person that, like, oh, wow. So, and we hear it all the time. And I get it. Like, you did time. No one really believes that, but it's like, that does something, kind of brings the situation down, the temperature down in the space, in the moment, and also starts to build in that trust. And so those, I had to say that because I definitely do hope that we can come together and do that in a different way, bring it in a different way, but collaborative way, right? With everyone here. And so we continue to, I wanted to say this, I don't, not too long ago, there was a 19-year-old girl that was in an intimate partner violence situation, and this concerns me. We have to figure this out, uh, and we didn't have a place to send her. And by the time 12 o'clock at night, and I was reached out to at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, 12 o'clock later on at evening, 1 o'clock, finally found a place for her to go to. When she got there, the process and stuff, and did you have your COVID, shot and all this other stuff? No, she's 19. Like, she's like, so they couldn't find a cot or a chair for her. So they basically put her out 3 o'clock in the morning. I got a call. This girl is walking the streets and 19 years old. And now there's somebody else, somebody following her. Right. And so it's like that kind of thing. And she just was in an intimate partner violence situation, really, really, like traumatizing. And then we continue to place people in situations that continue to traumatize them in other ways and exacerbate, the situation. And we talk about, people continue, like you said, Erica, like people continuing this behavior, right? But we really have to, Sasha, to your point, have to get to the root causes of things and recognize how we respond. Is it responding in a way that's empathetic, is understanding, and even compassionate? Because if we respond the way we've been responding, we're going to continue this. So we have to figure this out in a different way. I might not have answered your question, but I had to get this in before we close out, because we have to think about these things, right? We have a system, a criminal legal system that, and I'm a participant researcher. 97% of people inside have been impacted by some form of abuse. Hands down. People are still not talking about it because it still continues to be taboo, or I don't want, I don't need that, the shame, the guilt, whatever it may be on me. And so I'm not going to talk about it. Right. But we can pull that out. We can get to that root issue right there if we do it a little differently. Right. To everyone's point, incarceration, punitive measures are never the response. We have to understand poverty is a driving factor here. Poverty is a driving factor, and we have to introduce different things into these communities. Find ways of children and not to go to bed hungry. When a child or a young person is hungry and they hangry, right? They're going to go out there and get involved with something, and then they're going to try to build a family dynamic with others that are out there doing something that they shouldn't be doing, right? We have to understand where it starts from. And if the violence is happening in my home, 99.9% of the time, I'm going to go in the streets and do the same thing because it's happening at home. So it's just like certain ways to like look at this. And I just had to say that because I didn't really want us to end with that. And this is what we do at A Low Piece of Light. We try to identify, shed light on those areas, fill in those gaps, and figure out how we can fill in those gaps. But we do it in partnership within community. And I hope this right here builds a community that we can build out more and cover all these issues, because they're existing right now. We have people right now going on who are being abused ritualistically, right? We have people being abused based on other cultural norms in their cultures. That might be normal for us, but it's for them. But we know that it's harmful.
Thank you, Dr. Hilton. You definitely answered the question because you're really demonstrating why it's so important that we have survivors' voices at the table, whether it is in the sort of traditional institutional responses and as part of the sort of community responses that Sasha and Carolyn have been talking about. So thank you for that. We have just a few minutes left. I understand that there are questions from the audience, and I want to be able to get to those. So I'm going to invite my wonderful colleague, Dr. Rebecca Atkinson, to come on the screen and pose some of those questions to our panelists. Anyone can feel free to jump in. And I also just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Atkinson for all the work that she put into organizing this panel. We are so appreciative, and I am grateful to have her as a colleague. So, with that, Rebecca.
Thank you. And I know we are running a little short on time, so I have a question that I really just want to open up to all of our panelists. This has been a really heavy topic. There are things that we've talked about around like building community and building trust. But what gives you hope right now about the future of community and intimate partner violence efforts in both the city and nationally? And I'll open that up to whomever wants to answer first. Yeah.
I'll answer since people are quiet. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky right now for the Cities United Conference. Cities United is a public safety organization based out of Louisville, but that works across the country. And I think the ability to connect in these kinds of spaces, both virtually here and in person in Louisville, is part of what gives me hope. I think increasingly we are having these important conversations that I hope activate us to doing more collaborative work on the ground. So that gives me some hope and inspires this work, as well as my 5-year-old grandson, because I hope, pray, and am building him into a better man than some others as far as abuse and perspectives around violence.
I'll jump into when we first started Rise, people were so opposed of the work that we do. And I think what gives me hope is that now we have violence interrupters who are seeking IPV informed approaches. We are seeing survivors who are stepping into leadership, young people who are challenging harmful norms. And I think this what gives me hope is that there's a real appetite to do public safety differently, which is what we're trying to push for. So continuously hoping for that to continue happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, just to really piggyback onto that, people want change. People, our community people, they want healing. People are tired of being tired and tired of the abuse, tired of so many things. People just want an opportunity for something different. And I think that's what moves me because when I'm out there, boots on the ground, and I see it and I hear it, I feel it, if smell it, taste it, all those things is tangible. And people just want that. And it takes us to come together to bring that to them and comes together in ways. Let's support each other, right? There's like our organization, we don't have the funding like some others on this call do, but like help us support that because we are able within this framework reach a different population, but we can bring them in. Like we can just do what we're doing in silos, but come together in one big melting pot, basically, and just have everyone like continue in this ways. Like Carolyn Rise reaches out to me like for a certain population, like, can you help with this? And absolutely. And I do the same thing. You know what I mean? This is how we do it. We are the example of community. Let's continue to do that.
Yep. And I was going to say something very similar where, necessity is the mother of invention, right? And if there's anything we've learned now, it's like violence is the issue of our time and it's everywhere across the board and no one knows how to handle it. And so I think to Donna's point, I think I've seen so much of like the collaboration, the partnership, the ideas, the innovation sort of happen and kind of happen quickly, like more quickly than I've seen even in the city in the past few years. And I think thinking about all the collaboration on the ground, I feel like every time I go, it's October, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'm always going to events, right? And every year I'm like, there's so many more smaller grassroots orgs that are survivor led, that are in specific communities, that are like dealing with like an intersection of an intersection. And I think like that's super exciting because that's where the change is going to happen. So really looking forward to more of that.
Thank you, Commissioner Rebecca. I think given the time, that might be all we have for questions. So I just want to end on a note of gratitude to all of our panelists because you all give me hope. I really thank you for sharing your insights, your expertise, and really to the commitment that you all have in doing this work and in helping us imagine a different future for our communities and really, providing examples of that in communities both here in New York City and in Sasha's case, really around the country. So again, thank you so much. I think the conversation today really just reminds me that safety is about the presence of connection. It's about accountability. It's also about creating opportunity for our communities and helping to break the cycles of trauma that we know drive all of the violence that our communities experience. So thank you all for the work that you do. In the coming days, we will share a recording of this event. We had lots of people sign up and lots of people attend, but I'm sure there are folks who weren't able to. So we'll make sure to send the recording around so that folks that were not able to join are able to benefit from all of your wisdom in the conversation today. I want to thank our audience for joining us. We encourage you to please stay engaged. If you want to learn more about the Future of Public Safety Initiative, please visit our website. I think we threw it up in the chat. And you can also email us at reimaginepublicsafety@jj.cuny.edu. Again, we'll throw that in the chat. So if there's any follow-up or any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But thank you all for joining us and taking the time today. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.